This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Choiceology is a show about the psychology and economics behind the decisions we make every day and how to make better ones. I'm Dr. Katie Milkman. Join me as I share true stories from Nobel laureates, athletes, authors, and everyday people faced with monumental decisions. We'll share useful tools and strategies to help you make better decisions in your own life. You can find Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
Hi, and welcome to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the courts and the law and democracy, and I guess now flags. I'm Dahlia Lithwick. I cover the first few things. I'm becoming kind of an expert in the latter after Justice Alito featured in a second week of news cycle drama for flying more inflammatory political statements over his vacation home. My God, it makes me long for the days when Alito and flying was just about the salmon. On Thursday morning, the court handed down a big, bad voting rights decision, Alexander v. South Carolina Conference of the NAACP. Slate Plus members, you got to hear our scream into the void about that one, fresh off the presses on Thursday. But joining us on today's episode, our dear friend of the show, Professor Steve Vladeck, who is mid-cross-country move, and Mark Joseph Stern. And we're going to have a conversation about how legitimately screwed up and bonkers these last few weeks of this particular term really are. There used to be a time when May was, the semi-snoozy month before things went crazy at the end of June. You could say travel across the country to move homes or, plan a Memorial Day vacation. But everything is insane and likely to get more so. And so this week we really wanted to dig into all the different facets of this new normal. So maybe think of this as the, no, this isn't how any of this works edition of Amicus. We have a huge pileup of cases. The court is going to continue, apparently, to decide vital voting questions without ever fully understanding what the Purcell principle means. One justice is blaming his wife for a distress flag. The other justices say nothing. Every Supreme Court litigation shop is flooding my inbox every day with mail that says, tomorrow, this big case is going to be decided, but they don't know which cases are going to come down when because none of us knows anything. It's not just that the court is monarchic because it is not subject to any check or any balance or any authority. It's monarchic because it hands down decisions in the craziest manner that all but screams, because we can. So joining us to discuss all of the madness, my getaway driver, Mark Joseph Stern, Stephen Vladeck, who is departing UT Austin to teach at Georgetown Law School this fall. Lucky Georgetown. Listen, the paperback version of his amazing book, The Shadow Docket, came out this week as he was driving cross country. If you are looking for a belated Mother's Day present, an early Father's Day present, or just sorry you got caught carrying a super provocative Flag Day present, we highly, highly recommend. Welcome back, Mark. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Flag Day, I had not thought about the consequences of Flag Day being and especially, since 1943 when the Supreme Court handed down its great decision about the Pledge of Allegiance on Flag Day, I feel like Flag Day has otherwise been unassociated with the court, but let's make Flag Day great again.
It's back, baby.
Let's fly our freaky Flag Day flag high. So listen, I want to start with this big gerrymandering case, Alexander, that came down on Thursday. Mark and I chatted about it in a pop-up episode. I guess I want to ask you both, just as a kind of framing question, is there any way in your mind to connect up that 6-3 decision in Alexander, which more or less, I think, closes the door on a whole kind of class of racial gerrymandering claims, and the insanity, the performative insanity of Justice Alito's Teflon flag behavior? Is there a through line here that you can find? Because I hate that they're being covered as different stories, as kind of front stage, backstage stories. I think they're connected, and I think maybe we should try to name it because you are two great big brains. Steve, go first.
Well, I think the place to start is what are facts anyway? And that to me is the common theme across both of these. The sort of the nerdy technical problem with Justice Alito's majority opinion in Alexander is that the Supreme Court basically fancies itself a trial court and is deciding for itself factual questions that the trial court decided in this case, and to which the trial court is supposed to get deference. And that may sound like a small technical problem, but it's actually an amazingly remarkable sign of disrespect from an appeals court, any appeals court, to the hard work of trial judges, in this case, a 3-judge district court in South Carolina that, as Justice Kagan points out in her dissent, did a lot of work in this case. So, I think that's the sort of the through line to me is, facts are whatever Justice Alito wants them to be. My favorite piece of his sort of indirect relayed conversation with Shannon Bream about the upside down flag story was that he was worried about the kids at the bus stops in January 2021 when all of the local schools were closed and there were no kids at the bus stops. So, when you have a sort of a loose relationship with facts in the first place, maybe you're going to be less worried about facts found by other courts that you're supposed to defer to. That's my off-the-cuff stab at trying to tie these two things together.
I just want to add one funny thing, which is that even Clarence Thomas wouldn't fully join Sam Alito, sifting through the record from the district court and nitpicking at each fact. Clarence Thomas, in his otherwise characteristically gonzo dissent, right? Taking on Brown versus Board of Education, rejecting one person, one vote, saying racial gerrymandering is non-justiciable. He begins by saying, oh, but by the way, it is pretty weird that the majority decided to, quote, sift through volumes of facts and argue its interpretation of those facts. That's not how clear error review works. And so I'm not going to join that part of the opinion. Alito has lost even Thomas. And yet there's John Roberts lining up to join. There's Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh lining up to join. And it just feels like if those justices wanted to send Alito a signal in any way, shape, or form, whether it's about the flag, whether it's about the increasingly deranged jurisprudence, that he's taking a few steps too far, that could have been a good place to do it. Hey, maybe let's do some law, Buster. But they decided, no, we're all in on this opinion. And that is a very depressing signal for me heading into a bad June rising.
It's back to the politics of grievance. Alito is constantly aggrieved, right, by everyone and everything. And today he was aggrieved by, Justice Kagan's majority opinion in Cooper, which he at one point accuses her of misrepresenting, even though she wrote it.
Yeah, I think my slightly, I want to say gentler, but it's not gentler. It's probably grumpier version of the same point, Steve. I always use the word grumpy with Steve once in every show. It's an old inside joke that I don't care to explain, but it has to do with Muppets. But I think my version of the same point is these shifting presumptions of who is bad in the world are really interesting, right? And, as I noted on Thursday talking about the Alito opinion, it's amazing that you just want to give the benefit of the doubt to every state legislator ever, right? Who are picking their own voters, they are engaged in an enterprise that is kind of sketch to begin with. They all get the presumption of being in good faith. Whereas, again, if you look at the immunity case, the presumption is that every single federal prosecutor is a lying bastard. And it is just amazing to me how you can move through the world kind of creating these presumptive categories of friends and enemies. It's very Clarence Thomas. It's very Richard Nixon. It's not the way we do law.
You know who doesn't get the presumption of good faith is the plaintiffs in voting rights cases, right? Because there's this whole section where Alito says that these plaintiffs seek to transform federal courts into weapons of political warfare that will deliver victories that eluded them in the political arena, which is another way of saying vindicate the promises of the 14th and 15th Amendments.
I think there comes a point where we have to ask ourselves, if you were a justice who lived in the media ecosphere of the far right wing, and that was basically the world you consumed, and that was the information you were fed, well, how would the world look to you? And I think the answer is it would look a lot like apparently it looks right now to Justice Alito.
Which is one other point, Steve, that I think I want to drop here, because I didn't actually know about this flag. I just didn't. I guess I missed a beat. I didn't quite know about the January 6thers, upside down flag. Like, I think one of the things that I keep learning is how deep, deep, deep down the rabbit hole he is, right? This is not like Stop the Steal. This is not Don't Tread on Me. This is like an ecosystem within an ecosystem within an ecosystem that I don't even know. And it's so interesting to me, of a piece with what you're both saying, that my knock on Alito for a long time has been his utter failure of imagination, the inability to imagine anyone who hasn't lived his life. Every single woman in the United States who wants an abortion is just invisible to him. The physicians who are in the EMTALA case, they're real to him, but like the women who have to be helicoptered out of state, they don't exist. And the idea that he is so far down a wormhole that he couldn't possibly imagine the lives that you and I live, that just is kind of making my brain explode.
Well, there was a line, I mean, this just sort of got, I think, run over by subsequent events, but in the mifepristone case, when the court put Judge Kaczmarek's ruling on hold last April, there was a line in his really, really, I think, revealing dissent about the Biden administration not doing anything to disabuse anyone of the notion that it wouldn't comply with an adverse ruling. Like, that was a fever dream in, not even Fox News land, right? I mean, the KJP had literally stood at the podium in the press room and said, we're going to comply with whatever you do in this case. So, I think the question at some point becomes less about Justice Alito and back to where Mark was, more about the others. And how much they're going to abide this kind of behavior, both in his formal work and off the bench. And that, to me, is the real story of Alexander, is that there were no separate opinions besides Thomas, which, has problems of its own. But for Kavanaugh and Barrett and Roberts to basically sign on to this evisceration of the clear error standard, I think is not surprising. But when folks try to tell us that the court actually is not as far to the right as we think, and that it was pretty moderate, and that this term was actually a bit of a mixed bag, I would like to point back to that and say, try again.
Well, and just last week in the CFPB case, Kavanaugh and Barrett both joined the separate opinion by Justice Kagan that basically said Alito's dissent was doubly wrong. It wasn't just wrong for the reasons the majority said, it was wrong for all these other reasons. And that read to me at the time like at least a nudge at Alito, like, put your sane pants on, Justice, because we are not going to abide by this nutter. I mean, and that opinion that Alito wrote in the CFPB case is one of the worst he's ever penned, I think, right up there with the most recent Obamacare dissent, where he is living in sort of cuckoo land to the right of Fox News. But now we're getting these signals to the other direction that, Kavanaugh and Barrett will just go on with whatever he says when it comes to racial gerrymandering. I can't square it, but it's very disturbing.
I mean, it's certainly would be remiss of me not to say the words Nikki Haley. I mean, I think that the exact phenomenon that we are seeing at the court, where there is just shocking, staggering, anyone with any objectivity knows that this behavior is beyond the pale for appearance's sake, and yet a willingness to get behind it for some other reason that I suppose we have to just flick at. We could talk about this all year, but I want to talk about some of the stuff that you've been writing about what makes this term different, Steve. And one of them, as you point out, is that we have whole, I think crap ton is the word I want to use, of merits decisions that are coming, and they're all going to be, according to your amazing data-driven classification system, going to be really important. And of those, I think a bunch are nationally significant. This is not like the terms that I am used to, where there's 4 blockbusters in the last 2 weeks of June. This is an entirely different animal, and you've been sort of trying to parse out what that means and how that is sort of shaping May and June. And I'd love for you to give us a more fulsome explanation of how this is different.
Sure. I mean, so it's different in 2 ways that are going to sound like they're inconsistent, although I think they're coming from the same place. So, the first way, and this is something you guys already know, I mean, I think a lot of folks who follow the court at all know, the court's actually doing less, right? We're on track for maybe 58 or 59 merits decisions by the time we go home for the summer and go start crying again, which is going to be the 5th term in a row that the court doesn't get to 60. That hadn't been below 60 before that since 1864. And so there's a whole universe of cases that has completely disappeared from the Supreme Court's docket. I know you guys, have talked to Orrin Kerr about his Fourth Amendment obsession and why the Supreme Court won't take Fourth Amendment cases anymore, right? But Dahlia, they're taking less, and yet a remarkably high percentage of what's left are major cases, right? You've got these major administrative law cases. You've got these abortion cases. You've got these social media cases, which have gotten totally, I think, memory hold, right? Because so much other stuff is going on. You've got 2, not just 1, major gun cases. And oh, by the way, there are those 2 small January 6th cases, including one about whether former President Trump can be criminally prosecuted. So that's, depending on how you count, 18, 19, 20 major decisions that the court has to get through between now and the end of June. And, they're doing 3 or 4 a week right now. So the math sort of explains itself. We're going to get just slammed the last couple of weeks of June with a ton of major decisions that are going to be controversial. They're going to be head-scratching. And I think, Dahlia, that's going to pose an especially difficult challenge to folks like you and Mark and to, the Supreme Court press corps who has to try to explain all of this to everybody in a way that's going to keep their attention. Like, this is basically going to be the Friday night news dump of major Supreme Court decisions to end all Friday night news dumps. And I think that's a real problem.
I'm curious why you think this is happening. The slowdown of grants combined with the increase in really major grants. I am puzzled because I feel like different justices have different philosophies about granting, and there's not like one unified theory for why this is happening.
Yeah, and indeed, Justice Kavanaugh at the Fifth Circuit conference 2 weeks ago actually went out of his way to say, I think we should be taking more cases. And, in his defense, his voting pattern backs that up. I mean, he is the most common dissenter from denials of certiorari among all 9 of the justices, which, given where he is on the spectrum, is actually kind of surprising. You wouldn't think a justice who's in the relative middle of the court would actually be the most common dissenter from denials of cert. I think 2 things are going on, and I actually think they are related. The first is I think the court is getting a lot of pressure from below.
It's the Fifth Circuit.
From my dear friends on the Fifth Circuit, who at least as of now have not administratively stayed my departure from Texas.
There's time yet.
There's time. Some of this is because the Fifth Circuit has just gone completely off the deep end on some of these cases where the court has to take them and reverse. That's the CFPB case. That's almost certainly going to be the mifepristone case. Probably Rahimi. Probably NetChoice, right? The social media content moderation case. So part of that, Mark, is that the court has the sort of the docket where its hand is being forced. And then part of that is, the court taking cases it wants to take to mess with the administrative state. And what's remarkable to me about what Kavanaugh said at the Fifth Circuit and what Thomas said at the 11th Circuit and what Sotomayor said a little bit earlier this year is they're all talking about working harder than they ever have, and that they're all crazy busy, and that it's not like the sort of the shrinkage of the docket has freed up time. We know that the high-profile cases take more of their time. We know that it takes more of their energy when they're going back and forth about these concurrences and dissents. And so, my best sort of suggestion is that they have so many of these high-profile cases that they just don't have room for the lower-profile stuff. I mean, guys, we're going to get to Memorial Day with 8 grants for next year. 8. That's insane.
By Memorial Day, how many cert grants do we usually have, just for point of comparison?
More than 20.
Okay.
So, I mean, just the norm is that by the time the court leaves for its summer recess, it has filled its October, November, and December argument calendars because it's not going to grant any more cases till September. And so even a light October, November, and December calendar is usually 25 arguments, right, before the end of the year. And that means that would require the court between now and when it rises for its summer recess to triple the number of cert grants. You know, it's possible, but like, what the hell? Whatever you think of what the court's actually doing in these cases, this rather seismic shift in the nature of its docket is a big deal. And it's something we ought to be talking about. And I don't know if there were a Congress, like a Senate Judiciary Committee, that actually cared about the Supreme Court. They might even think to hold hearings about these shifts in the docket.
Imagine that. Can I just add one gloss that I think is sort of implicit in your critique, Steve, which is that when they are slammed with all these super high profile cases under a time limit, the work product suffers, right? And I think the best example of that so far is Trump v. Anderson, the Colorado ballot removal case, right? That came down in a month because the court actually can act quickly when it wants to. And they wanted to get it out before the Colorado primary. But after we all read it a couple times, I think it became clear there was this misalignment between the majority and the dissent. They didn't quite line up. The dissent was criticizing things that weren't in the majority opinion. The majority opinion was saying things that sort of didn't clearly reflect in the dissent's critique. And then, as we at Slate discovered, the dissent, which was labeled as a concurrence, was in fact originally a dissent before being changed at the last minute. It was all very hinky, and I feel like that's going to be the issue times 15 in the next month or so. As they're trying to push out all these major cases, they're going to get sloppy. They're not going to be able to move these drafts back and forth as much as they'd like and really sort of nail down a final product. And the result will be mess in the law, right?
Mess in the law, but also, Mark, I think two other things that tend to be true when the court rushes is they tend to be more honest. There's less time to sort of sanitize what they're doing, and they tend to be madder at each other. This is why, I mean, when folks talk about, yes, the court can move quickly, I mean, the historical examples of decisions where the court has moved really quickly, almost no one thinks any of the actual opinions in those cases are any good. Right, whether it's the Nazi saboteurs or the Watergate tapes case or Bush versus Gore, like the result, don't like the result. None of those are held up as like models of the Supreme Court handing down a smart decision as opposed to maybe a politically expedient one. And I think this is the problem, is that because the court has this completely arbitrary obsession with clearing its decks before the summer recess, which, by the way, is just something they impose on themselves. There's no statute or rule that requires them to do that. You know, we're in for, if I can say this on a podcast, we're in for a shitstorm. And it's not just because of what the court's going to do in these cases, which is going to be really problematic, I think, politically. Just from a matter of the stability of law, it's going to be ugly.
We're going to pause now to hear from some of our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. There's now a game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/amicus to get 15% off your first order when you use Amicus at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/amicus and use the code AMICUS at checkout for 15% off. So, cat mommies and cat daddies, I am well aware that you are as obsessed with your cat as I am with mine. Her name is Arby. She's named after RBG. But if you're really honest, keeping the litter box clean is probably a cause of some friction between you. Litter Robot has been pretty darn satisfying for the cats of the world because, among other things, it is fast, it doesn't smell bad, it cleans immediately, and it also weighs your cat on the way. Never scoop again with Litter Robot. Litter Robot is the solution to all of your litter box problems. Litter Robot's self-cleaning technology automatically cleans after every use, so your cats will always have a fresh bed of litter to do their business, and your friends will not think your house smells like litter box. Litter Robot will send a notification to your phone when it needs to be emptied. It will even give you data and insights to stay on top of your cat's health. It doesn't get any easier than this. Your cat will thank you. Join over 1 million happy pets and pet parents who have upgraded to Litter Robot. As a special offer to listeners of the show, go to stopscooping.com/amicus and enter promo code amicus to save an extra $50 on any Litter Robot bundle. That's an extra $50 off any Litter Robot bundle at stopscooping.com/amicus and enter promo code amicus at checkout. Stopscooping.com/amicus and enter promo code amicus. Back now to my conversation with Professor Stephen Vladeck, latterly of University of Texas, Austin, imminently of Georgetown Law, and of course, the one and only Mark Joseph Stern. I think so much of the 104-page opinions that go out of their way to both gaslight and insult one another is kind of like working it out in front of the kids, right? It's the justices are mad. Again, I don't mean to talk about the halcyon days, but you wouldn't really see them punching each other in the throat multiple times a week. And I think that one of the things that's happening is, if we're going to characterize them as important cases, these are the cases that in the years when the court would only do same-day audio of 5 or 6 cases a year, these were the ones when the justices acted badly, right? And this was what the public heard. Now it's all of 25 cases. Yep. And so I think that there's a one-to-one kind of congruence between taking quote unquote important national, hot button cases and then acting out in really personal, often juvenile ways in many, many pages. And I think in a sense, it's almost like the docket has become the materialization of all the other shit that has no place to reside, because they have to behave as though they're normal.
So I agree with all that, Dahlia. If I could take a half a step back and try to put this in slightly broader terms. So our Supreme Court blends two functions that a lot of countries divide among two courts, right? We have a Supreme Court that is simultaneously a constitutional court and a Supreme Court of Appeals. Israel divides that function even among the same judges. Germany has separate courts to do those things. And when we talk about the big Supreme Court decisions, we tend to be talking about the court as a constitutional court, which is where it looks the most ideological. It's where it tends to look the most partisan. It's where the justices tend to get the maddest at each other. And we tend not to talk a lot about the High Court of Appeals, resolving the technical circuit split in the bankruptcy cases or in the CivPro cases, right, or in the antitrust cases. And what's really unfortunate about that is it's in the High Court of Appeals hat where the Supreme Court actually looks most like a court and where the justices get to behave the most like judges. And the more that the docket becomes dominated by the constitutional court side of things, the more that the court's going to look as bad as a lot of people think it is. And for folks like me who think that the court is bad a lot of the time, but not all the time, right? It makes it harder to persuade folks that there's actually principled judging going on at least some of the time in that building. One last note, by the way, on the timing. So Alexander, it was 225 days from oral argument to the opinion coming down. Just to put that in context, there's only one other case the court has all this term where that's even possible. It's that Vidal versus Elster trademark case. Most of the big cases the court decides, even if they decided at the end of the term, will have had about a third of the amount of time and some even less for the court to actually deliberate them. And that's part of the problem here, is that the court is compressing an increasingly large number of high-profile divisive cases into a window where it's going to exacerbate every single thing that's wrong with how the court is currently doing its job.
You made the point, Steve, that the 1st of July magic day of jetting off to give partisan speeches on someone else's dime. You didn't mention that. I'll just say it. That's a sort of, an unforced error that the court has, it could just decide cases through August and make its lives better and ours worse. But there's a couple of other, I flicked at one of them, the magical Thursday decision day, the not finding out when decision days are. You know what the Supreme Court of Canada does? Tells you what's coming down. Imagine being able to plan. And I guess so much of this, tell me if I'm wrong, but when you describe this sort of pancaking effect at the end of this term with these huge cases, no time to write them. Holy cow, they just heard EMTALA, they just heard immunity. How are they going to write that and also write Rahimi? It's a mess, but also, they have to fly flags. And I guess my question for you is, so much of the performance of we can't tell you anything, so just come sit in the room and count boxes with us, is just gratuitous and silly. And I would love one of you to tell me why we do it this way, because I haven't slept in months. Thank you.
It's like The Crown, right? I mean, it's pomp and circumstance, because it's like I'm gonna botch this scene, but there's a scene in season 4 or season 5 of The Crown where there's a whole defense, maybe it's from Queen Mary, of why the Crown sort of does all of this ceremony, right? And why the Crown does all of this tradition, and why it's so important to stick to its norms. It's because it's in those sort of weird, mystical things that we believe that there's something, higher than us and different than us. The problem, Dahlia, is that this then gets in the way of even the most technical accommodations. I mean, right, I've been pushing the court for years to timestamp what they hand out, especially when it's not one of those regular opinions. They won't do it just because. This is really in the weeds, but all the court's docket numbers are wrong because they reset the docket numbers at a bizarre point in July because of something that hasn't been true since 1980. There are so many ways the court could avoid this. One example, stop arguing cases in April. Have oral argument October, November, December, January, February, but not after mid-March, so that you buy. I mean, if you're really committed to the bit of being out by July, stop arguing big cases 6 weeks before you're leaving. I mean, so I think part of it is this is an institution that is so committed to its traditions, at least in part because once it starts changing, it makes it hard to defend against other changes. But there are really low-hanging, non-controversial, easy, obvious things the court could do to make everyone's lives easier that I think would not start that snowball rolling down the hill that the court won't even consider.
And a lot of it, too, is an arrogant rejection of transparency at even the most basic levels, right? A refusal to tell the public what's going to happen to maintain maximal latitude for themselves behind the scenes. I think they fear, well, if we told the public this case is coming out tomorrow and then there's a sudden switch behind the scenes, everyone would know that something happened and they would know something about our deliberations. And for some reason, that's bad. This is a branch that is committed to operating in absolute secrecy, as though, as Steve said, that secrecy plays a major role in its sort of dignity and thus its authority. But I'll just note, no other court operates this way. It's sort of shocking when you're a Supreme Court reporter and you deal with any other court. I mean, the Texas Supreme Court, another one near and dear to Steve's heart, you can bring your phone in and live tweet. You can take pictures of them. Every federal court of appeals now has all of this transparency stuff. I mean, the 10th Circuit is experimenting with an AI chatbot. They're trying to move into the 2020s. And meanwhile, the Supreme Court had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the live stream audio era. I'm grateful for that, but I feel like they're absolutely wedded to these other practices that have no real basis in doing law or judging in some kind of particularly sound way.
But again, I mean, Mark, I'll just say really quickly, because I don't want to belabor the point. Even before we get to things that actually people might push back against, like pre-announcing which decisions are coming down, how about just live streaming the hand downs? The court is now willing to live stream all of the oral arguments, but won't live stream hand down announcements. which means that we're still stuck waiting to hear about what the folks in the press room are saying if the opinion doesn't go right up on the website. Like, the court is so resistant to change. And I think some of that is just itself like part of the same delusion, right? Which is that, once we start even making small accommodations, we're letting the fox into the henhouse. And I think that kind of attitude is part of this broader phenomenon of the court just thinking that it's not accountable to anybody, that it should do what it wants, when it wants, and only that.
To which I would add, just going to keep beating this drum until it falls apart. But, there are two stories today. One is Samuel Alito's flag flying habits. The other is a huge doctrinal shift in a voting rights case. And I think that if you just keep reinforcing that the entirety of the court's public interest is like the girl who pops out of the birthday cake the last 3 days of June, and everything else is none of your business. And that includes ethics, and that includes like who writes the syllabus, and it includes, who, deviates from a bench statement when a hand down happens. And none of that is reported. None of that, right? It didn't happen. And that's because the only thing that matters under this construction is what's in the four corners of the Alexander opinion, and the flags that you fly are none of your business. So it's a way not just of self-aggrandizing, not just a way of self-mystification, but a way of actually setting the terms of the debate, which are that absolutely nothing that this institution does matters except for these opinions.
At the risk of tying this back to my book in one very loose sense, part of why I wrote the book, right, is because I think when we look at the court beyond those four corners, Dahlia, right, when we look at the whole field and everything the court's doing on the bench and off, you see a very different court. You see a very different institution. You see things that even folks who like the bottom lines that the justices are reaching in all of these cases might still find not like the ideal way to run a railroad. And I think we're just going to see so much more of that over the next 6 weeks. And it's just keeping track of it is going to be a job unto itself.
And it can't be done just going case by case and saying, well, this is what the stakes are and this is what could happen, which we are not doing today on this podcast for a very conscious reason, because I think that occludes all of the weird stuff in the seams that Steve is pointing out that his book so, eloquently explores.
One example, just to sort of segue us into the summer, the fact that last week in clearing the way for Louisiana to have a second majority minority district, the Supreme Court, without even writing an opinion, sanctioned an application of the so-called Purcell principle in a context in which it had never been applied before, at least never been fully endorsed by a majority of the court before. Guys, as we head into election season, this summer and this fall, that's going to have massive ramifications too. Perhaps even bigger ramifications than Alexander, where the map in South Carolina was already set, versus, this cryptic order from the court citing favorably to Purcell that now lower courts are going to rely upon to do lots of mischievous things, whether for or against your political party of interest, as legal challenges to election rules ramp up heading toward November.
I was actually going to ask you to unpack, Steve. You had written in your newsletter about this same case, which I'm going to ask you to explain for a second. But you'd written, quote, one of the real problems with Purcell is that the court's use of it, especially during the 2020 and 22 election cycles, left at least the perception that the justices were invoking it when it helped Republicans, not when it helped Democrats. Suddenly you have, as you say, this reversal. Oh, wait, there's another at least short-term political win for Black voters in Louisiana. The three liberals dissenting. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to people why that happened, because it's not immediately apparent. And then it becomes more Kremlinology.
Yeah, it's a complicated case to begin with. Without doing 26 rounds on congressional redistricting in Louisiana, because that is a mini-series unto itself, the short version is that both the NAACP, which is representing the intervening defendants in this case, and the state of Louisiana, who are not usually on the same side, were on the same side that the three-judge court's order in this case should not be allowed to go into immediate effect. They just disagreed as to why. Right. So the NAACP said because it's wrong and there are lots of problems with it and it's going to irreparably harm lots of voters in Louisiana. And the state's argument was because Purcell. And I think part of what happened was you had the Republican appointees seeing this golden opportunity to, sort of apply Purcell, this incredibly subjective, powerful tool that the Supreme Court has blessed as a way to freeze lower court rulings that change the rules for elections. And so you get an opportunity to bless Purcell in a redistricting case where it's not clear Purcell should apply at all, months away from the actual election in Louisiana, which does not have primaries, right? And all where the short-term headline is, yay, Louisiana Democrats. And I think the reason why the 3 Democratic appointees all dissented is because they're playing chess, not checkers. And, they understand exactly how much damage this is going to do in the long term, probably to Democrats more than Republicans, but more fundamentally to stability in election cases because Purcell is so malleable. And so, I sort of took this as the 6 Republican appointees being a bit opportunistic and the 3 Democratic appointees, seeing the whole field and being worried about the long, had the majority not cited Purcell, I suspect at least 2 of the 3 Democratic appointees would have said nothing. But because they cite Purcell, now it's a problem.
More on the mayhem to come in the last few weeks of the Supreme Court term with Steve and Mark after these messages.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar. Rubble, rubble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Rubble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Jon Stewart is back in the host chair at The Daily Show, which means he's also back in our ears on The Daily Show Ears Edition podcast. The Daily Show podcast has everything you need to stay on top of today's news and pop culture. You get hilarious, satirical takes on entertainment, politics, sports, and more from Jon and the team of correspondents and contributors. The podcast also has content you can't get anywhere else, like extended interviews and a roundup of the weekly headlines. Listen to The Daily Show, Ears Edition, wherever you get your podcasts.
Can Mark and I ask you on the occasion of paperback coming out how the court's doing in the great Shadow Docket sweepstakes? It certainly feels as though you've brushed them back a little bit. I don't know if you single-handedly, but I think they've been behaving a little better on the Shadow Docket or just more sneaky and wily.
It's a messy question, right? And it's messy at least in part because it's really the justices are they not knit. I think probably the biggest thing that the book accomplished was to put it at least on the radar screen as something we ought to talk about. So in the Idaho transgender adolescent medical care case from April, you had this remarkable 13-page concurrence by Justice Kavanaugh that was joined by Justice Barrett, where Kavanaugh tries to explain why shadow docket cases are hard. And, I think there's actually some stuff in his opinion that really is kind of right and makes a lot of sense. But there are also parts where he completely sort of concedes some of my sharpest critiques, which is that, they're washing away the equitable balancing that they're supposed to be doing in these cases, which is that they're putting a thumb on the scale on the merits in a way that they're not supposed to be, which is that, he's worried about locking in their positions when his record is entirely to the contrary in cases like the Alabama voting case. So if folks who have been vocal about the shadow docket, and I would put Justice Kagan into this camp right next to and probably well ahead of me, have accomplished anything, it's that at least now people are thinking about it. If you look at the sort of the data, I think the court has moved a little. I mean, I think we're going to end this term, barring some weird developments over the summer, as the second term in a row where the total number of interventions are down compared to the Wild West of 2020 and 2021. I think the court is trying to provide a little more process in some of these cases. The Good Neighbor ozone pollution cases, which came to the court as an emergency application in October, here we are in May and they still haven't been decided. I think there have been some positive changes, but I think the real change has just been that they're not ignoring it and they're not just pretending it's not a thing, even if there's still been some, I think, less than good behavior. And, as you guys know, on Wednesday of this week, we finally saw Senator Blumenthal, with co-sponsored by Senator Durbin, introduce the Shadow Docket Sunlight Act, which, I think is not the solution of all solutions, but at least is a positive sign that Congress is starting to think about how to legislate in this space as well.
Can I ask you both a final question? Because it's the one that I now wake up asking myself pretty much every day. And it's not, am I going to bathe. It's a harder question, and it is, you're John Roberts. You're the institutionalist guy.
Boy.
I know. You're the institutionalist guy. You wanted to be John Marshall. You wanted to be remembered as having held this institution together and like steered it through the rocky, shoals. And that was the task you set yourself, and you're quite voluble about that. And now your people are crazy. And I sort of feel as though he's just past the tipping point of, even if he wanted to do a thing, and we can talk about what the thing would be, I don't think he can do it anymore. And I'm just curious if you all have some sense, Mark, we can start with you, that there is, somebody was tweeting about he should just stop assigning opinions, that'll show us. But, what in the world of conceivable, I'm including Earl Warren, telling Abe Fortas to quit. What in the world of conceivable interventions could a John Roberts, the institutionalist, take? And what are the chances that he does it? And so I ask again, maybe not your John Roberts, because I know what you do, Mark, but John Roberts is John Roberts. What does he do right now?
I feel like John Roberts, the institutionalist, is missing in action and has been for some time. I mean, one revealing signal here is that in the transgender adolescent medicine case that Steve noted, every justice noted their vote except for the chief. He was completely missing. We have no idea how he voted. And the chief's questions from the bench in some of these high-profile cases have been really trollish and hacky. Like in the Fisher case about the January 6th prosecutions, he sounded kind of like Thomas and Alito. In the homelessness case, he sounded so horribly cruel and insensitive. And so I worry that whatever John Roberts appeared magically in the desert sands from 2012 through maybe 2023, it's like RIP to that man. And we're back to the early Roberts, who was just a flaming conservative who knew how to write well. I would love for Steve to tell me I'm wrong, but especially with him signing on to Alito's Alexander opinion and joining the other men in the Trump ballot removal case, not even, making a compromise with the 4 women justices, I feel like he's just done trying to police his colleagues, and he's doing this YOLO court thing that we had previously assumed he was embarrassed by.
I have often found John Roberts to be an enigma. And I think that is only that much more the case this term. I mean, Mark, part of me wants to reserve judgment a bit, because I think we're going to have a lot of big decisions where maybe he'll restore some of our faith that he actually does care about the institution in ways that are divorced from just his ideological goals. I guess to me, the Colorado case, I think, is a huge problem, because those are the cases by which chief justices are measured. And there's just no universe in which that's anything but a failure on his part. His inability to keep the court together, the fact that Justice Barrett had to write a separate opinion saying, we could have done this on narrow terms and you people didn't. But I also think it's not the Roberts court anymore. And it hasn't been, since the day that Justice Ginsburg died. And I think that the reality is that probably by this time in July, you're going to see lots of pieces about how this is Amy Coney Barrett's court, and how Barrett's going to be the real decisive vote in the cases that matters, because either she picks up Roberts or Kavanaugh, or dare I say, in one case a term, Gorsuch. But I think in the long term, Roberts the institutionalist is not Rehnquist the institutionalist. And that difference is something we're seeing more and more of every year. I mean, just one reminder about Chief Justice Rehnquist. For all of the, sort of bitterness I think a lot of folks have about Rehnquist, when he was Chief Justice in 1999, in his year-end report, that, sort of empty project that we get every December that's supposed to be full of pablum, he went on for pages yelling at Senate Republicans for not providing up or down votes to President Clinton's judicial nominees, because of what he thought about the institution. And I think what we're seeing more and more of is what John Roberts thinks the institution needs is not what we think he ought to think. As for what he can do, I mean, guys, I've said this before and I'll say it again. If he really believed that the institution were on the brink and that, some grand gesture was needed, there's exactly one thing he can do that none of the other justices can stop him from doing, and that's resign. resign in a Democratic presidency with a Democratic-controlled Senate and give the seat to a Democrat. He's never going to do that. And so I think the question is, is he able, short of that, to exert any kind of influence over the, rightward sort of radical turn in the court's jurisprudence? And Mark, for the reasons you say, like, if anything, his votes are going the other direction. I mean, at least as of now, and guys, there's still lots to come. As of now, there's been, I think, one case this term where he went with the lefties on an ideological split. It was the razor wire emergency order back in January. It'll be more than one by the time we're done, but I'm not sure, given how things are going, that it's going to be as many as we might have thought 2 or 3 years ago. And that's, I think, a real problem for him and for the court and for how we think about the court.
Steve Vladeck is author of the New York Times bestseller, The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic, out this week in paperback. He has just departed from the Charles Allen Wright Chair in Federal Courts at the University of Texas Law School and landed at Georgetown, where he will continue to write in all the places, contribute to CNN, do all the things, and somehow do it with like clarity and grace while the rest of us feel like we are on fire. Steve, thank you for joining.
Thank you, guys.
And Mark Joseph Stern covers the Supreme Courts, the state courts, all the courts, the law, and the end times with me here at Slate. Mark, thank you for being here. This was actually an incredibly useful conversation heading into the end of term.
Thanks, Dahlia.
And thank you, listener, for coming on this Opinionpalooza journey with us, which started this week, as you have just heard. And it is going to be bananas. And it's going to be bananas, as I think we've proven, for largely gratuitous, irrational, institutional, monarchic reasons. But hey-ho. Happy Opinionpalooza season to those who celebrate. Slate Plus subscribers are going to have access to our emergency pop-up episodes as the biggest decisions come down. You can always join us at slate.com/Amicus Plus, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page. That is a wrap for this episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening in, and thank you so much for your letters and your questions. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer with help from Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We will be back with another episode of Amicus next week, and until then, hang on in there.